Chapter 1. "No," said Jackson with a shy little smile. "I'm sorry, I won't play hide and seek." It was Christmas Eve, and there were 14 of us in the house. We had had a good dinner, and we were all in the mood for fun and games. All, that is, except Jackson. When somebody suggested hide and seek, there were loud shouts of agreement. Jackson's refusal was the only one. It was not like Jackson to refuse to play a game. "Aren't you feeling well?" someone asked. "I'm perfectly all right, thank you," he said. But, he added with a smile that softened his refusal but did not change it, "I'm still not playing hide and seek." "Why not?" someone asked. He hesitated for a moment before replying. "I sometimes go and stay at a house where a girl was killed. She was playing hide and seek in the dark. She didn't know the house very well. There was a door that led to the servants' staircase. When she was chased, she thought the door led to a bedroom. She opened the door and jumped, and landed at the bottom of the stairs. She broke her neck, of course." We all looked serious. Mrs. Fernley said, "How terrible! And were you there when it happened?" Jackson shook his head sadly. "No," he said, "but I was there when something else happened. Something worse." What could be worse than that? "This was," said Jackson. He hesitated for a moment, then he said, "I wonder if any of you have ever played a game called Smee. It's much better than hide and seek. The name comes from It's Me, of course. Perhaps you'd like to play it instead of hide and seek. Let me tell you the rules of the game. Every player is given a sheet of paper. All the sheets except one are blank. On the last sheet of paper is written Smee. Nobody knows who Smee is except Smee himself or herself. You turn out the lights, and Smee goes quietly out of the room and hides. After a time, the others go off to search for Smee, but of course they don't know who they are looking for. When one player meets another, he challenges him by saying, "Smee." The other player answers, "Smee," and they continue searching, but the real Smee doesn't answer when someone challenges. The second player stays quietly beside him. Presently, they will be discovered by a third player. He will challenge and receive no answer, and he will join the first two. This goes on until all the players are in the same place. The last one to find Smee has to pay a forfeit. It's a good, noisy, amusing game. In a big house, it often takes a long time for everyone to find Smee. Perhaps you'd like to try. I'll happily pay my forfeit and sit here by the fire while you play. "It sounds a good game," I remarked. "Have you played it too, Jackson?" "Yes," he answered. "I played it in the house that I was telling you about." "And she was there? The girl who broke, so—" No, said someone else. "He told us he wasn't there when she broke her neck." Jackson thought for a moment. "I don't know if she was there or not. I'm afraid she was. I know that there were 13 of us playing the game, and there were only 12 people in the house. And I didn't know the dead girl's name. When I heard that whispered name in the dark, it didn't worry me. But I tell you, I'm never going to play that kind of game again. It made me quite nervous for a long time. I prefer to pay my forfeit at once." We all stared at him. His words did not make sense at all. Tim Voos was the kindest man in the world. He smiled at us all. "This sounds like an interesting story," he said. Come on, Jackson. You can tell it to us instead of paying a forfeit. Very well, said Jackson, and here is his story. Chapter 2. Have you met the Sangstons? They are cousins of mine, and they live in Surrey. 5 years ago, they invited me to go and spend Christmas with them. It was an old house with lots of unnecessary passages and staircases. A stranger could get lost in it quite easily. Well, I went down for that Christmas. Violet Sangston promised me that I knew most of the other guests. Unfortunately, I couldn't get away from my job until Christmas Eve. All the other guests had arrived there the previous day. I was the last to arrive, and I was only just in time for dinner. I said hello to everyone I knew, and Violet Sangston introduced me to the people I didn't know. Then it was time to go in to dinner. That is perhaps why I didn't hear the name of a tall, dark-haired, handsome girl whom I hadn't met before. Everyone was in rather a hurry, and I am always bad at catching people's names. She looked cold and clever. She didn't look at all friendly, but she looked interesting, and I wondered who she was. I didn't ask, because I was sure that someone would speak to her by name during the meal. Unluckily, however, I was a long way from her at the table. I was sitting next to Mrs. Gorman, and as usual, Mrs. Gorman was being very bright and amusing. Her conversation is always worth listening to, and I completely forgot to ask the name of the dark, proud girl. There were 12 of us, including the Sangstons themselves. We were all young, or trying to be young. Jack and Violet Sangston were the oldest, and their 17-year-old son Reggie was the youngest. It was Reggie who suggested Smee when the talk turned to games. He told us the rules of the game, just as I've described them to you. Jack Sangston warned us all. If you are going to play games in the dark, he said, please be careful of the back stairs on the first floor. A door leads to them, and I've often thought about taking the door off. In the dark, a stranger to the house could think they were walking into a room. A girl really did break her neck on those stairs. I asked how it happened. It was about 10 years ago before we came here. There was a party and they were playing hide and seek. This girl was looking for somewhere to hide. She heard somebody coming and ran along the passage to get away. She opened the door, thinking it led to a bedroom. She planned to hide in there until the seeker had gone. Unfortunately, it was the door that led to the back stairs. She fell straight down to the bottom of the stairs. She was dead when they picked her up. We all promised to be careful. Mrs. Gorman even made a little joke about living to be 90. You see, none of us had known the poor girl, and we did not want to feel sad on Christmas Eve. Well, we all started the game immediately after dinner. Young Reggie Sangston went round making sure all the lights were off, except the ones in the servants' rooms and in the sitting room where we were. We then prepared 12 sheets of paper. 11 of them were blank, and one of them had Smee written on it. Reggie mixed them all up, then we each took one. The person who got the paper with Smee on it had to hide. I looked at mine and saw that it was blank. A moment later, all the electric lights went out. In the darkness, I heard someone moving very quietly to the door. After a minute, somebody blew a whistle, and we all rushed to the door. I had no idea who was Smee. For 5 or 10 minutes, we were all rushing up and down passages and in and out of rooms, challenging each other and answering, "Smee? Smee? After a while, the noise died down, and I guessed that someone had found Smee. After a time, I found a group of people all sitting on some narrow stairs. I challenged and received no answer. So Smee was there. I hurriedly joined the group. Presently, 2 more players arrived. Each one was hurrying to avoid being last. Jack Sangston was last and was given a forfeit. "I think we're all here now, aren't we?" he remarked. He lit a match, looked up the staircase, and began to count. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, he said, and then laughed. "That's silly. There's one too many." The match went out, and he lit another and began to count. He got as far as 12. Then he looked puzzled. "There are 13 people here," he said. "I haven't counted myself yet." "Oh, nonsense," I laughed. "You probably began with yourself, and now you want to count yourself twice." His son took out his electric torch. It gave a better light than the matches, and we all began to count. Of course there were 12 of us. Jack laughed. "Well," he said, "I was sure I counted 13 twice." From halfway up the stairs, Violet Sangston spoke nervously. "I thought there was somebody sitting 2 steps above me. Have you moved, Captain Ransom?" The captain said that he hadn't. "But I thought there was somebody sitting between Mrs. Sangston and me." Just for a moment, there was an uncomfortable something in the air. A cold finger seemed to touch us all. For a moment, we all felt that something odd and unpleasant had just happened, and was likely to happen again. Then we laughed at ourselves, and at each other, and we felt normal again. There were only 12 of us, and that was that. Still laughing, we marched back to the sitting room to begin again. Chapter 3. This time I was Smee. Violet Sangston found me while I was searching for a hiding place. That game didn't last long. Soon there were 12 people, and the game was over. Violet felt cold and wanted her jacket. Her husband went up to their bedroom to fetch it. As soon as he'd gone, Reggie touched me on the arm. He was looking pale and sick. "Quick," he whispered. "I've got to talk to you. Something horrible has happened." We went into the breakfast room. "What's the matter?" I asked. "I don't know. You were Smee last time, weren't you?" "Well, of course I didn't know who Smee was. While Mother and the others ran to the west side of the house and found you, I went east. There's a deep clothes cupboard in my bedroom. It looked like a good hiding place. I thought that perhaps Smee might be there. I opened the door in the dark and touched somebody's hand. "Smee?" I whispered. There was no answer. I thought I'd found Smee. Well, I don't understand it, but I suddenly had a strange, cold feeling. I can't describe it, but I felt that something was wrong. So I turned on my electric torch, and there was nobody there. Now, I am sure I touched a hand. And nobody could get out of the cupboard, because I was standing in the doorway. What do you think? You imagined that you touched a hand, I said. He gave a short laugh. I knew you would say that, he said. Of course I imagined it. That's the only explanation, isn't it? I agreed with him. I could see that he still felt shaken. Together we returned to the sitting room for another game of Smee. The others were all ready and waiting to start again. Chapter 4. Perhaps it was my imagination, although I'm almost sure that it was not. But I had a feeling that nobody was really enjoying the game anymore. But everyone was too polite to mention it. All the same, I had the feeling that something was wrong. All the fun had gone out of the game. Something deep inside me was trying to warn me. "Take care," it whispered. "Take care." There was some unnatural, unhealthy influence at work in the house. Why did I have this feeling? Because Jack Sangston had counted 13 people instead of 12? Because his son imagined he had touched someone's hand in an empty cupboard? I tried to laugh at myself, but I did not succeed. Well, we started again. While we were all chasing the unknown Smee, we were all as noisy as ever. But it seemed to me that most of us were just acting. We were no longer enjoying the game. At first I stayed with the others, but for several minutes no Smee was found. I left the main group and started searching on the first floor at the west side of the house. And there, while I was feeling my way along, I bumped into a pair of human knees. I put out my hand and touched a soft, heavy curtain. Then I knew where I was. There were tall, deep windows, with window seats at the end of the passage. The curtains reached to the ground. Somebody was sitting in a corner of one of the window seats behind a curtain. Aha, I thought. I've caught Smee. So I pulled the curtain to one side and touched a woman's arm. It was a dark, moonless night outside. I couldn't see the woman sitting in the corner of the window seat. "Smee?" I whispered. There was no answer. When Smee is challenged, he, or she, does not answer. So I sat down beside her to wait for the others. Then I whispered, "What's your name?" And out of the darkness beside me the whisper came, "Brenda Ford." Chapter 5. I did not know the name, but I guessed at once who she was. I knew every girl in the house by name except one, and that was the tall, pale, dark girl. So here she was, sitting beside me on the window seat, shut in between a heavy curtain and a window. I was beginning to enjoy the game. I wondered if she was enjoying it too. I whispered one or two rather ordinary questions to her and received no answer. Smee is a game of silence. It is a rule of the game that Smee and the person or persons who have found Smee have to keep quiet. This, of course, makes it harder for the others to find them, but there was nobody else about. I wondered, therefore, why she was insisting on silence. I spoke again and got no answer. I began to feel a little annoyed. Perhaps she is one of those cold, clever girls who have a poor opinion of all men, I thought. She doesn't like me, and she is using the rules of the game as an excuse for not speaking. Well, if she doesn't like sitting here with me, I certainly don't want to sit with her. I turned away from her. I hope someone finds us soon, I thought. As I sat there, I realized that I disliked sitting beside this girl very much indeed. That was strange. The girl I had seen at dinner had seemed likable in a cold kind of way. I noticed her and wanted to know more about her. But now I felt really uncomfortable beside her. The feeling of something wrong, Something unnatural was growing. I remembered touching her arm, and I trembled with horror. I wanted to jump up and run away. I prayed that someone else would come along soon. Just then I heard light footsteps in the passage. Somebody on the other side of the curtain brushed against my knees. The curtain moved to one side, and a woman's hand touched my shoulder. "Smee?" whispered a voice that I recognized at once. It was Mrs. Gorman. Of course she received no answer. She came and sat down beside me, and at once I felt very much better. "It's Tony Jackson, isn't it?" she whispered. "Yes," I whispered back. "You're not Smee, are you?" "No, she's on my other side." She reached out across me. I heard her fingernails scratch a woman's silk dress. "Hello, Smee. How are you? Who are you? Oh, is it against the rules to talk? Never mind, Tony. We'll break the rules. Do you know, Tony, this game is beginning to annoy me a little. I hope they aren't going to play it all evening. I'd like to play a nice quiet game, all together beside a warm fire." "Me too," I agreed. "Can't you suggest something to them? There's something rather unhealthy about this particular game. I'm sure I'm being very silly, but I can't get rid of the idea that we've got an extra player, somebody who ought not to be here at all." That was exactly how I felt, but I didn't say so. However, I felt very much better. Mrs. Gorman's arrival had chased away my fears. We sat talking. "I wonder when the others will find us," said Mrs. Gorman. After a time, we heard the sound of feet, and young Reggie's voice shouting, "Hello, hello, is anybody there?" "Yes," I answered. "Is Mrs. Gorman with you?" "Yes." "What happened to you?" "You've both got forfeits. We've all been waiting for you for hours." "But you haven't found Smee yet," I complained. "You haven't, you mean. I was Smee this time." "But Smee is here with us," I cried. "Yes," agreed Mrs. Gorman. The curtain was pulled back and we sat looking into the eye of Reggie's electric torch. I looked at Mrs. Gorman, and then on my other side. Between me and the wall was an empty place on the window seat. I stood up at once, then I sat down again. I was feeling very sick, and the world seemed to be going round and round. "There was somebody there," I insisted, "because I touched her." "So did I," said Mrs. Gorman in a trembling voice. "And I don't think anyone could leave this window seat without us knowing." Reggie gave a shaky little laugh. I remembered his unpleasant experience earlier that evening. "Someone's been playing jokes," he said. "Are you coming down?" Chapter 6. We were not very popular when we came down to the sitting room. "I found the two of them sitting behind a curtain on a window seat," said Reggie. "I went up to the tall, dark girl. 'So you pretended to be Smee, and then went away,' I accused her. She shook her head. Afterwards, we all played cards in the sitting room, and I was very glad. Some time later, Jack Sangston wanted to talk to me. I could see that he was rather cross with me, and soon he told me the reason. 'Tony,' he said, 'I suppose you are in love with Mrs. Gorman. That's your business, but please don't make love to her in my house during a game. You kept everyone waiting. It was very rude of you, and I'm ashamed of you.' "But we were not alone," I protested. "There was somebody else there, somebody who was pretending to be Smee. I believe it was that tall, dark girl, Miss Ford. She whispered her name to me. Of course, she refused to admit it afterwards. Jack Sangston stared at me. Miss who? He breathed. Brenda Ford, she said. Jack put a hand on my shoulder. Look here, Tony, he said. I don't mind a joke, but enough is enough. We don't want to worry the ladies. Brenda Ford is the name of the girl who broke her neck on the stairs. She was playing hide-and-seek here 10 years ago. Giles Hampton was spending a short holiday in Wales. A friend of his had recently sold his business in Liverpool and had moved to Wales. This friend, whose name was Beverly, had built himself a house in Carnarvonshire, near the Snowdon Mountains. There was an ancient church called Fabian Far a few hundred yards away from his house, so Beverly called his new house Fabian Far too. Giles was very interested in geology. He loved studying rocks and stones. Since that part of Wales is of particular interest to the geologist, Giles was very glad indeed to receive Beverly's invitation to visit him. Giles arrived at Fabian Far on the evening of October 10th. The house was very modern and extremely comfortable. It stood between the mountains and the Conway Valley. A few hundred yards behind the house lay the steep, rocky mountains. The weather was fine, and for the first week of his stay, Giles went with Beverly on several short geological expeditions. They also went shooting together once or twice, and they visited neighbors in the district. But on October 18th, Beverly had business in the local market town. So Giles decided to make an all-day excursion to a place on the other side of the mountains, about 10 miles away. The sky was cloudy when Giles set off after an early breakfast. In his bag were his sandwiches and his geological hammers, and information from Beverly's servant Perry about his route across the mountains. It was after 12 o'clock when Giles arrived and began unpacking his hammers. The sun had come out, and he was hot, tired, and uncomfortable. But he soon forgot his discomfort when he examined the many interesting rocks. It was 3:30 before he had finished. He packed his hammers and notebook away in his bag again and started on the journey back to Fabian Far. By this time, the sky was cloudy again. As he walked along, light rain began to fall. Then, as he climbed higher, a thick, damp mist came down and covered everything. Soon the mist grew thicker, and he could see only a few feet in front of him. On his earlier journey across the mountains, Giles had looked out for landmarks: a waterfall, an old tree, a small lake. He thought these would help him to find his way back to Fabian Far. But in the mist, everything looked strange and different. Soon he crossed a stream which he did not recognize. Then he knew that he had taken the wrong path. For nearly half a mile, he went back the way he had come, only to become more lost and confused than before. This is no good, he thought. He sat down for a few moments to consider his position. The thought of a cold, uncomfortable night alone on the hillside did not particularly worry him. But he knew that Beverly would be very anxious. Giles did not want to worry his friend. He'll come out to search for me, thought Giles, and bring the neighbors too. I can't let him organize a search party. I really can't. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps on the hillside above him. He shouted, and a voice answered him in Welsh. From out of the mist came an old man with a huge dog by his side. Although the man was old, he stood straight and tall. He wore a heavy cloak of dark cloth that came down to his ankles. He wore no hat, and his hair was long and white. His big red face shone with kindness. The old man spoke again in Welsh. Giles made signs to show that he did not understand. The old man smiled kindly. "I'm lost," said Giles, making more signs. "I want to go to Fabian Far." The old man seemed to understand. "Fabian Far," he repeated several times and smiled again. Then he felt inside his long cloak and pulled out a map. He spread the map out on a stone in front of him. Beverly's new house was not, of course, on the map, but the church of Fabian Far was clearly shown. With his thin old hand, the stranger pointed to a place on the map. He spoke again in Welsh, then pointed again. "He is telling me that we are here," said Giles to himself. Then the old man pointed out the path that Giles must take to reach Fabian Far. He did this 3 times, to make sure that Giles understood. Then he pushed the map into Giles's hands. Giles tried to refuse this gift, but the old man only laughed and smiled. Giles thanked him warmly and pushed the map into his coat pocket. Then he set out along the path that the old man had shown him. After a few steps, he turned. He saw a shape through the mist, standing and watching him. He waved his hand and set off again. The next time he turned around, the old man had disappeared. Giles walked fast. The mist had become thicker than before, but the path was a good one. From time to time, he checked his route on the map. Soon the path led him down a very steep hillside. In the mist, Giles could see only a few feet ahead, so he moved very carefully. Suddenly, his foot turned on a sharp stone, and he almost fell. That stone probably saved his life. It flew up from under his feet and rolled down the steep path. He heard it rolling faster and faster. Then the noise stopped. A few seconds later, Giles heard a crash as the stone hit the ground hundreds of feet below. The path had led him to the edge of a cliff. Giles picked up another stone and dropped it. Again he heard the distant crash as it fell over the cliff. He looked at the map again. There was no cliff on the route that the old man had shown him. For the first time, Giles became seriously worried. He sat down miserably on a large rock, took out his pipe, and found a match to light it. "Well," he thought, "I'll just have to sit and wait for the mist to clear." Perhaps it was an hour later when he heard voices shouting on the hillside below. Giles shouted back as loudly as he could. Slowly, the shouts got nearer. He recognized the voice of Beverly's servant, Perry, who had become anxious about Giles's safety and had set out to search for him. Beverly himself had not returned from the town. Giles was extremely grateful for this. He hated to trouble his friend. Perry led Giles safely back towards the house. Giles walked slowly and quietly, thankful to be rescued. But for some reason, he was unwilling to tell Perry about the stranger in the mist. He explained that he had taken the wrong path. In less than an hour, he was changing his wet clothes. At dinner, too, he kept quiet about it, simply telling Beverly that he had lost his way in the mist. "I suppose I took the wrong path," he said, "and I found myself at the edge of a cliff." "You had a very lucky escape," said Beverly. There have been some nasty accidents in these hills. A man was killed about 4 years ago. I believe he was found at the bottom of the same cliff. That was before I came here, of course." He turned to his servant. "I'm sure you remember the accident, Perry," he said. "Am I right? Was it the same place?" "It certainly was, sir," said the servant. "It was a gentleman from London. They buried him in the churchyard here. I was working for Captain Trevor at that time. He let us all go to the burial. Mr. Roberts buried him and prayed over the grave. It was all in the local newspaper. I kept the newspaper. It was the Carnarvon and District News. I'll fetch it if you like, sir." "That's a good idea, Perry," said his master. In a few minutes, Perry returned with an old newspaper. Beverly read the report aloud. Early on Wednesday morning, the body of a young man. A doctor examined the body and decided that the man had been dead for several hours. The unfortunate man was Mr. John Stevenson, a young lawyer from London. Mr. Stevenson had been on holiday in Wales, and he had been exploring our beautiful mountains and valleys. When he did not return to his hotel in the evening, Captain Trevor, a local man, bravely organized a search party. Unfortunately, the thick mist made their work more difficult. It appears that the dead man took the wrong path in the mist and fell over the cliff, hitting the sharp rocks below. In the dead man's pocket was a copy of a very old, out-of-date map. It showed a long disused path over the hill. Of course, as everyone in the district knows, the path was destroyed many years ago by the Great Landslide. That was a terrible disaster which carried away a large part of the hillside. The sad death of Mr. Stevenson should be a warning to everyone. Never depend on an out-of-date map. A modern, accurate map of the district is available from the offices of this newspaper. Price, 9 pence. When Giles heard about the out-of-date map in the dead man's pocket, he was very excited. He told Beverly the whole story of the stranger in the mist. Beverly was very interested. "Do you remember anything about a map, Perry?" he asked his servant. "I certainly do, sir," said Perry. It was a very old map. Mr. Roberts still has it, I believe. "Then will you please send a message to Mr. Roberts for me?" said Beverly. "Give him my best wishes and ask him to come and have coffee with us. And ask him to bring the old map with him, please." Perry hurried away to carry out his master's orders. "I have the map that the old man gave me today," said Giles. "It is still in my coat pocket. I'll go and get it." He fetched the map and spread it out on the table. The two men studied it carefully. In the mist, Giles had not noticed anything strange about the map. But in the brightly lit dining room, the map looked very unusual indeed. It was on thick paper that looked yellow with age. The writing was very old, with long SS that looked like FS. "Look at that," said Beverly, pointing to some writing at the bottom of the map. "Madog Ap Reis, 1707. Just then, Mr. Roberts arrived. He listened carefully to Giles's story. Then he took a map out of his pocket. It was exactly like the map that lay on the table. "I've always wondered how the dead man got that map," he said. "It's very unusual. There is only one other copy, and that's in the museum in Caernarvon." "And who was Madog Ap Reis?" asked Giles. "He was a rather strange, lonely old man," said Mr. Roberts. He lived alone on the hillside and spent most of his time praying. He died in 1720. Of course, that was before the landslide destroyed the path to Adwi Yir Arion. Whenever there was a mist, Madog Ap Reis walked among the hills in his long, dark cloak with his dog beside him. He drew this map. He always carried a copy about with him to give to travelers who had lost their way. Some local people say that his spirit still walks among the hills, searching for lost travelers. But that's only a story. I don't take it very seriously. How sad, said Giles, after Mr. Roberts had drunk his coffee and left. Madog Ap Reis was a good, kind man. He only wanted to help. But he led poor Stevenson to his death, and he almost killed me.